His parents laughed in his face when they found out he poured every last cent into a rundown gas station in the middle of the desert. But they weren't laughing anymore when they saw what he turned it into. You want to know who that guy is and why a long-buried past came roaring back to life in the very place people once called a dump? Don't look away, because what's about to unfold will make you rethink the meaning of the word failure. Ryan Caldwell used to teach history at a small community college in Tucson. His class had maybe a couple dozen students. The lights flickered constantly, and the heater clanked like it was on its last breath every time the temperature dropped. Still, he stuck it out until one early fall morning when the department chair called him into the office and handed him a single sheet of paper. Staff cuts, budgets tight. One sentence, and it was over. No one cried. There was no goodbye party. Ryan just packed his books into an old backpack, locked his cabinet, and walked out like he'd never spent 4 years there. A few months later, he was doing whatever odd jobs he could just to get by. Bussing tables at a Chinese restaurant, helping out in warehouses, even signing up for night shifts as a delivery driver. His cramped rental on the south side of Tucson barely fit a fold-up bed and a rattling old fan. Every morning, Ryan got up at 5 a.m. to head to work, but in his parents' eyes, he looked like nothing more than a washed-up freeloader. Charles and Margaret Caldwell, his parents, had once been well-known professors at Northern Arizona University. They'd retired a few years back, living in a big house in Flagstaff with walls covered in awards, conference photos, and unpublished manuscripts. To them, success meant a PhD, teaching at the Ivies, publishing in academic journals. Not knocking on doors to deliver pizza. Ryan didn't argue anymore. He was used to the disappointed looks. It happened every time he visited. Dinner usually ended with something like, "Have you reconsidered going for your PhD?" Or worse, "Margaret, did we make a mistake letting him choose his own major?" Then one weekday afternoon, Ryan was curled up on the floor with a history book resting on his chest when his phone buzzed. He was half scrolling through listings on an old real estate app when a headline made him pause. "For sale, old gas station on historic Route 66, $10,000 as is." The photos were terrible. Rusted sheet metal peeling off the roof, a pump snapped clean in half, a sign that only read ST in faded letters. But something about it held him. He zoomed in. In the distance was a stretch of red rock mountains, the old asphalt road winding away like a forgotten piece of memory. A week later, he drove out to Kingman. The gas station sat quietly by the roadside, far from any neighborhood. Nobody cared. The grass was knee-high, the windows shattered, and the gas price sign had faded to blank. The air smelled like rust, old oil, and time. Most people wouldn't call it an opportunity. But Ryan saw something else. He didn't call anyone, didn't ask for advice. He just emailed the landowner and wired the money, nearly everything he had left after months of scraping by. The payment confirmation came through at 11:48 p.m. 2 days later, when Margaret found out, she called in a fury. "What the hell did you just do, Ryan? $10,000? On what?" Her voice cracked through the phone. "An old gas station," Ryan said, calm as ever. A beat of silence. "A gas station." She stressed each word. "Do you think you're living in some kind of documentary?" Charles grabbed the phone. "People live to move forward, not to dig through garbage. You're a quitter." Ryan didn't argue. He just said, "I don't want to live by your definition of success anymore. I want to do something that actually means something." "Something that means something?" Charles scoffed. "You're making a joke of yourself. That gas station is nothing but dust and bats. You just crushed your future." Ryan hung up. He sat still for a long time. Not sad, not angry, just lighter, like he'd finally cut loose a frayed rope that had been wrapped around his neck for years. The next morning, he drove back to Kingman. The gas station emerged through a haze of dust. No one around, no sound, empty, cold. The wind rattled the metal signs against each other with a dull clink. He stepped out of the car and stared from a distance. It wasn't beautiful. It didn't look promising, but it felt right in a way that couldn't be explained. Like a place that had been waiting for someone to finally listen. Ryan opened the front door. The hinges let out a long, aching creak. Inside, it was dark and stifling. The smell of dust, old motor oil, and rusted metal hit him in the face. He stepped in. No lights, no plan, No expectations, just a strange pull. Like this place still had a story left to tell. The next morning, Ryan came back with a wire brush, gloves, a few old rags, and some cheap tools he picked up at a discount shop in Kingman. The gas station floor was cracked like a spider web, each tile coated in dust and the dry husks of dead bugs. The walls were stained and peeling, patches of plaster flaking off to reveal raw red brick underneath. Some spots were so damp they had moss growing bright green. He crouched down, picking up shards of broken glass in the dim light. His torn glove let a sliver cut through, drawing a thin line of blood on his fingertip. The cash register counter was missing a leg, leaning like it had been knocked over years ago. Ryan propped it up with a brick and let out a long breath. Every time he touched something in that place, it made a sound, like it was complaining about how long it had been forgotten. In the afternoon, he drove out to a flea market nearly 10 miles away, the kind of place that sold rusted license plates, crumpled paper maps from the 70s, and old roadside junk. He dug through a pile of random stuff and picked out a few vintage plates and a faded Route 66 map with red pencil marks showing old pit stops from decades ago. The guy running the stall looked Ryan up and down and asked, "Collecting for a diner or something?" Ryan just shook his head. "No, I'm trying to rebuild an old gas station." The guy smirked. "Good luck with that, man." By the time Ryan got back, it was getting dark. He laid out a thin tarp on the floor, leaned against the wall, and opened a box of instant food. The noodles were cold, chewy, and way too salty. He didn't bother heating them up. Outside, the wind howled through the door cracks, banging the metal signs like uninvited knocks. The gas station sat in the middle of an empty stretch of land, swallowed by the night. Every time the wind picked up, he flinched a little. But Ryan didn't leave. 3 days later, he got an email from his mom. "If you want to go back to school, we're willing to help, but in return, please sell that gas station." Ryan didn't reply right away. That night, he just stared at his phone screen, that old feeling creeping back into his chest, the feeling of being treated like a kid who couldn't be trusted to run his own life. He typed a short line, "I don't need to go back to school. Thanks, though." Then he turned off his phone. The next day, while cleaning out the back room, what used to be a storage area and now looked like a graveyard of empty crates, snapped wires, and dust so thick he had to cover his mouth with a cloth, Ryan noticed a patch of dark wood along the wall near the corner. He knelt down and shined a flashlight on it. The panel was loose, held in place by a few rusted nails. He grabbed a small rod and started prying at the edges. Each nail that popped out echoed with a sharp clack in the silent room. Behind the wooden panel was a small recess, just deeper than a hand. Inside it sat an old tin box, its surface caked in thick dust and streaked with dried reddish-brown paint. Ryan gently pulled it out and set it on the floor. It clicked as he placed it down, the lid popping open slightly. Inside were rolls of film, carefully wrapped in worn burlap cloth. Beneath them was a leather notebook, cracked and dry, its corners yellowed with age. His heart pounded. He reached for the notebook like it might vanish if he touched it too hard. That night, Ryan rented an old film projector from a supply shop near Kingman. He set it up right there in the station, running a power line from his car and using a makeshift whiteboard as a screen. He sat in a folding chair, eyes locked on the flickering image as the first reel began to play. A group of people, Mexican, some native, standing right in front of this gas station, smiling and waving at the camera. No one looked shy or unsure. They looked comfortable, like they belonged there. The footage was grainy but alive. A woman folded fried dough in the corner. Kids played tag between the gas pumps. An old man rested a guitar on his knee and strummed a short tune. No one wore name tags. There were no captions. But in the corner of the frame, the gas station sign was clear. The very place Ryan was sitting. No doubt about it. He opened the notebook. The handwriting was neat, steady, written in faded purple ink. The first line read, "It all started here, because they weren't allowed in the regular restaurants." Ryan sat in silence, the notebook open in his hands. He didn't blink as he read each line. Notes on the different groups who passed through, on meals quietly shared, on handwritten conversations between people who weren't allowed to speak to each other anywhere else. He closed the notebook and leaned his head against the wall. The whole station was dark now, lit only by the faint glow of his car headlights streaming through the cracked window. He didn't know exactly what he was holding, but it was more than just a few old film reels and a decaying notebook. It was proof. A voice for those who'd never been named in the history books. And maybe, for the first time in his life, Ryan didn't feel lost anymore. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the shattered window and lit up the old wooden crates, Ryan was still sitting in the corner, back against the wall, the notebook resting on his lap. He'd barely slept all night. Not because of fear, but because his mind wouldn't stop spinning around the film reels, the handwriting, and that one note that had cut deeper than the usual sting of disappointment. He didn't know what he was supposed to do next, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just ignore what he'd found. Not after seeing those people with his own eyes, laughing, playing, living, as if they once had a whole forgotten world tucked into a quiet corner of America. That day, he got in his car and drove nearly 2 hours to Phoenix to meet up with an old friend named Andrew, now working at a local history museum. They'd been classmates in a graduate program focused on the history of the American Southwest. Andrew had gone on to pursue research. Ryan had taken the teaching route. When Ryan laid the film reels and notebook on the table, Andrew only needed a few seconds before his brow furrowed. He didn't say anything right away. Instead, he quietly powered up a film scanner. "Where'd you find these?" Andrew asked, eyes locked on the screen. "An old gas station. Route 66. I just bought it," Ryan answered. Andrew looked up, paused for a moment, then spoke slowly. "Ryan, if this is real, you're sitting on a historical gold mine." Ryan gave a dry smile. "My dad thinks I'm digging through trash." A few days later, the museum sent an official email confirming it. The materials were authentic, never archived anywhere, and likely the personal property of someone who once ran the gas station during the post-World War II era. Before Ryan could even feel excited, his phone started vibrating nonstop. His mom called. He didn't pick up. An hour later, his dad called. Still no answer. Finally, an email from his mom popped up. "Ryan, we need to talk. Whatever you're doing, it's starting to get out." That afternoon, Charles showed up at the gas station. No warning, no knocking. He just shoved open the creaky wooden door and stepped in like he owned the place. "What the hell are you trying to do here?" he asked, eyes sweeping the room. "Setting up a circus? Throwing a street fair?" Ryan placed a hand on the counter, voice calm. "If you came just to be sarcastic, you shouldn't have come at all." Charles didn't listen. "You know how many people have ruined their lives chasing stupid dreams? You're not Indiana Jones. This isn't some documentary. This is real life, and in real life, people need money to survive." "I haven't asked you or Mom for a single dollar," Ryan said, voice firmer now. "Not yet. But when you go broke, who's gonna deal with the mess?" Charles stepped closer, jabbing a finger at the box of film reels on the table. "This crap, who cares?" Ryan opened the notebook and flipped to the page with a hand-drawn map showing where different groups had once gathered at the station. People lived here, ate here, rested here, got turned away from other places just because of their skin. This was where they got to be human. Charles paused, then let out a dry laugh. "And you think a few scraps of paper are going to rewrite history?" Ryan closed the notebook. "No, but at least it won't stay buried." They didn't say another word. Charles turned and walked out. No goodbye. That night, Ryan stayed up alone, carefully mounting photo prints from the film onto cardboard backings, labeling each one by hand. Silent lunch, girl with the pastry box, guitar man by the pump. The next day, he rented an old wooden signboard and painted a line across it in rough, steady strokes. "Rest Stop History, stories we weren't allowed to tell." He hung it right in front of the station. No one came. Not a single visitor. But that night, Ryan wiped down the glass door again, straightened each photo, and neatly arranged the materials on the makeshift shelves, like they mattered. Because they did. The next Saturday morning, while sweeping the front lot, Ryan noticed a small pickup truck pull up to the station. An elderly Mexican woman stepped out slowly and walked toward the building. She stopped in front of a photo from the first reel. The one with 3 children playing under the old gas station sign. "I used to be here," she said, eyes fixed on the image. "That's my mother." Holding the youngest one. I didn't think anyone remembered this place." Ryan didn't know what to say. He simply invited her inside, offered her a chair, and poured a glass of water. The air felt heavy, like a new layer of time had just unfolded around them. She began to tell stories, slowly, but every detail was vivid. The long detours they had to take after being refused service, the nights waiting on the roadside for help, and the quiet moments when someone here gave them food. No questions asked. That night, Ryan added a new photo to the board. Underneath, he wrote in small, careful letters, "They were here once, and now they've come back." Word about the old woman's visit spread faster than Ryan expected. A few days later, more people began showing up, some carrying faded photographs, others asking if he could replay the reels. Ryan said yes. He set up the projector again and ran the opening footage. They sat on folding chairs, quietly watching. No one said much, but their eyes all carried the same look: surprise, disbelief, and something deeper. The quiet awe that a place like this still existed. About a week later, a history professor from the University of New Mexico showed up at the gas station. She was originally from El Paso, specializing in communities erased from mainstream American history. She didn't make an appointment. She just walked in, introduced herself, and said, "I need to see everything you've got." Ryan laid everything out on the table. The film reels, the notebook, the map, the printed photos. The professor went through each item one by one. She didn't ask questions, didn't show surprise. At the end, she said just one thing: "If you're willing to present this publicly, I'll make it happen." 3 weeks later, Ryan stood in Santa Fe, speaking at a cultural conference on the US-Mexico border. He wasn't used to crowds, and he had no clue what people meant by dressing appropriately. But when he held the mic, he spoke like he was still in that gas station, in plain language, in the voice of those whose stories had been left behind. The room was silent, not with applause, not with fanfare, just a stillness that meant people were really listening. After the talk, people came up. They asked questions. They wanted to see more. Some asked if they could visit the station. One of them was a journalist from PBS Arizona. It took just a few weeks for them to finish the 15-minute feature. The title, From Gas to Glory. A story about an abandoned gas station and the man who turned it into a place where forgotten memories could finally speak. The segment aired on a Sunday night. Ryan didn't watch it live. He heard about it from neighbors the next day. And that morning, new visitors began showing up at the station. A middle-aged couple brought a wedding photo of their parents, taken on the roadside in front of the station in 1959. An elderly Navajo man from Window Rock came, sat silently through the old footage, then pulled a folded letter from his pocket. It was one he'd written to his mother in 1960, saying, "This gas station is the only place I haven't been chased away." Ryan didn't feel pressure. He didn't feel pride either. He just welcomed each guest, told them what he knew, and carefully put each piece of history back in its place after every screening. Meanwhile, Charles and Margaret heard about it on TV, but they didn't call. No reaction, no questions. Ryan didn't hold it against them. In fact, he felt relieved, not having to hear one more word, whether it was praise or sarcasm. Mid-month, a letter arrived from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They had approved a $75,000 grant to restore the gas station as a community history exhibit. Ryan used the money to expand the back area. He built a small screening room, installed a vintage reel-to-reel projector, and soundproofed the walls with reclaimed wood. Outside, he repainted the storefront, keeping the original sign intact, adding only one small line beneath it: "Entrance to Memory." The station doors stayed open every weekend. He never charged admission. If guests showed up, he played the films. If not, he cleaned tables, labeled photos, sorted records. Some days, only a few people came, sat for an hour, then quietly left. But for Ryan, that was enough. No one came for gas. But the station came back to life, not through engines, but through memory. And that made the place feel a little less empty than before. One quiet weekend afternoon, a boy around 8 years old walked in, holding his grandmother's hand. They stopped in front of a printed photo from the reels, a group of workers pouring concrete for the road leading into the station. The old woman froze, then pointed at the man in the middle of the crowd. "That's your grandfather," she whispered. I've never seen this photo before. I didn't even know he helped build this place." Ryan stood nearby, saying nothing. The boy looked up at her, then turned to him. "Do you have more pictures?" Ryan nodded toward the display shelf. "I'm still looking," he said, "but I think I'm going to need help." The boy nodded back, then took his grandmother's hand and led her onward. She glanced back once more, eyes shining red. Ryan stayed behind the counter. A soft breeze slipped through the cracked window, and in that moment, everything that had once felt heavy, once dismissed as pointless, now had a place. Quiet, but real. That afternoon, after the boy and his grandmother left, Ryan cleaned up the display table. He wiped down the photo frames, reorganized the materials, locked the film cabinet. The station had gone quiet again. Late sunlight spilled sideways through the window, dust drifting like glittering ash in the air. As he flipped the sign to closed, he heard soft footsteps behind him. A woman stood on the front step. Long dress, hair neatly tied back, a canvas tote in her hand. She didn't knock. Didn't call his name. She just walked in, slow and steady, like she had always belonged there. Ryan froze, still holding the lock. Their eyes met. Neither of them spoke. Margaret Caldwell, his mother, looked around the room, taking in each photo, each item on display. She paused for a long time in front of the small wooden sign on the wall. Rest Stop History, curated by Ryan Caldwell. Her eyes didn't water, her hands didn't shake, but they were deep, steady. She moved slowly through the room, trailing her fingers along the wooden counter, nodding faintly when she saw the old notebook next to the projector. No one guided her. She didn't need a tour. When she reached the counter, Ryan still hadn't said a word. He wasn't sure what to say, and he didn't quite know what he was feeling. She opened her bag, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and set it gently on the wooden counter. She slid it toward him, then turned and walked out the door. Ryan picked it up. The handwriting was familiar, simple, short, no explanations. "I'm sorry I couldn't see the value when you first began." He read it 3 times, no signature, no added note. But it was enough. He folded the paper, tucked it into his shirt pocket, and stepped back inside. Nothing in the room had changed, but somehow it felt bigger. 2 days later, a small package arrived from Flagstaff. No return message, no note inside. Just an old brown leather notebook, wrapped in newspaper, tied with a thin fabric string. Ryan knew it the moment he held it. His father's notebook. The one Charles used to jot down ideas, outline arguments, scribble research notes during his teaching years. Ryan had seen him write in it every night, under the warm yellow light of his study lamp. Flipping through the first few pages, Ryan saw the usual notes, comparisons of civilizations, archival analysis, a few hand-drawn maps. But in the middle of the notebook, there was a single page that stood out. The paper was clean, the handwriting different, neater, slower. You didn't study to become a historian, you lived to preserve history. Ryan sat down, holding the notebook, flipping back and forth between pages. There were no more lines, there didn't need to be. One sentence, and it was like someone had finally unlatched a door that had been stuck in his chest for years. He didn't call back, didn't send a letter, didn't write an email or a text. He simply took a small glass case from behind the counter and placed his father's notebook inside, labeled it Personal Archive, donated by C. He positioned the case right beneath a black and white photo of an immigrant family, holding hands, stepping into the gas station. Their smiles worn with fatigue from the road. Ryan took a few steps back and looked at the room. No more criticism, no more wary stares, just him, and the stories no one had ever finished telling. There was nothing left to prove, no one left to convince. Everything that needed to be said had been said, in the quietest way possible. From now on, the only task was to keep telling these stories, for those who had been left behind. Those without names in textbooks, without portraits in museums, without memorials anywhere. Except here. With him. The early March sun in Arizona wasn't harsh, but the dust-laced wind was the same as ever, slipping through every crack, every seam in the walls. That morning, Ryan stood quietly under the awning of the gas station, watching a small group from the state office mount a new bronze plaque beside the entrance. The plaque gleamed in the light, etched deeply with the words, "In memory of those who waited in silence." No mention of his name. None needed. The station's designation as a state cultural heritage site hadn't come with a grand ceremony. It was the result of quiet weekends, patient document scans, and countless small conversations with people who had lived these memories firsthand. There were no ribbons, no speeches, just a few locals watching, a few elders nodding slowly. Ryan didn't stand with the group. He stayed in the back, holding a broom, sweeping the walkway from the parking lot to the front door. When it was over and the crowd had thinned, he was the last to leave the awning, picking up a stray flyer someone had dropped and straightening the crooked map on the wall. The story made its way onto a few local papers. Some history blogs and academic pages reposted photos of the gas station, along with excerpts from the 1948 journal Ryan had uncovered. Soon after, he was invited to join 3 different projects: restoring an old train depot in Winslow, reconstructing an Italian immigrant settlement in Yuma, and digitizing a statewide railroad archive. He turned all of them down. "It's not that I don't care," he told someone from the preservation board. "I just don't want to leave this place." This place, once dismissed as a junk pile in the desert, was now where kids from the local public school came once a month. Not for souvenir photos, but to hear stories about people they'd never read about in their textbooks. On some weekends, groups of history students from the University of Arizona would show up and ask to help, cleaning display cases, sweeping floors, labeling files. Ryan didn't instruct like a professor. He just pointed and let them figure it out. "None of this is in the books," he once told a student. "History's not just about recording things. It's about standing still long enough to actually hear." The kids started coming more often too. Some drew pictures of the gas station. Some copied their grandmother's stories by hand and asked to tape them beside the photos. Not for grades, but because they wanted others to see what their families had once hidden or once felt ashamed to share. Ryan stayed the same. He didn't speak at dedication ceremonies. He didn't pose for magazine features. Every morning, he swept the path from the entrance to the old wooden bench beside the pump. He changed the water in the flower vase, recentered crooked labels, and always rehung the small faded flag from 1950, the one he'd found rolled up in a broken drawer the day he bought the station. Once someone from PBS came by, asking to film a follow-up. Ryan just shook his head. "No need for more voices. Everything worth saying is already here." Someone once asked him, "Why don't you expand? Turn this into a full museum?" Ryan just smiled, because it doesn't need to be big. It just needs to be right. That afternoon, the sun beat down on the tin roof, ticking as it expanded in the heat. A light breeze lifted the faded flag, making it flutter just slightly. Ryan was fixing a crooked frame when the sharp sound of tires braking echoed across the gravel lot. A man in his 40s stepped out of the car, worn button-down shirt, a water bottle in hand, eyes scanning the place like someone who'd just arrived from a long road. He wandered slowly, taking in each photo, pausing in front of the station owner's 1948 notebook. Then he turned to the young volunteer polishing the display case. "Excuse me," he asked, "who brought this place back to life?" She didn't look up, just smiled and said, "Just a guy who refused to forget." Behind the wooden door, Ryan heard every word. He didn't step out. He didn't have to. Because what mattered most wasn't who did it. It was that the story had been told and someone was there to listen. A few months later, an 8th grade student sent Ryan a handwritten letter. The handwriting wobbled a bit, the strokes still young and unsure, but every sentence rang true. Near the end, there was one line that made him stop and read it again. And again. "If my grandfather ever waited at that gas station, I think he'd be proud someone remembered." Ryan didn't write back, but he folded the letter, slid it into a small envelope, and taped it inside display case number 6, right beside the photo of a native family's old pickup truck. There are things we can't fix. People who left without leaving a single word behind. But if even one person remembers, if someone pauses just for a moment in the middle of their journey to listen, then the past still lives, not through noise, but through silence that's finally been given the dignity it always deserved. And maybe that's how we truly make history, not by shouting it loud, but by refusing to let it be forgotten. What about you? Have you ever thought about the forgotten stories around you? Is there a place in your memory that's been waiting quietly to be heard? Share your story in the comments below. And if you believe these are the kinds of stories worth keeping alive, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next journey into memory. Honest, quiet, and more meaningful than you might think.